record. So good afternoon, everyone. This is our quarterly public CAA meeting. We hold these meetings every quarter, specifically for those community action agencies that are in units of local government, because we recognize that public CAAs have a little bit of a different context and needs and opportunities. And so we wanted to create at the partnership a space for public CAAs to connect with one another. I'm Mary Beth Schnaper-Remrev. I'm the Director of Organizational Capacity Building here at NCAP. And for a little bit of context, for those of you who don't know, I started at a public community action agency almost now 15 years ago, and I worked at that public community action agency for 7 years. And so have a deep understanding and appreciation for some of the challenges and, again, those opportunities that public CAPs have. I think I mentioned, but today we are in meeting mode. This is meant to be a collaborative space for us to chat with one another. So please feel free, come off mute, put things in the chat, turn on your cameras. We'd love to connect with you. Also behind the scenes is my colleague Terry Bearden, who also started in community action when she was 6. She's very knowledgeable about community action, all things community action. So if you need anything, put it in the chat and Terry will help get you situated. All right, so want to start out, as we always do, with the promise of community action. The promise reads that community action changes people's lives, embodies the spirit of hope, improves communities, and makes America a better place to live. We care about the entire community, and we are dedicated to helping people help themselves and each other. Whether you're a public CAP or a private CAP, this absolutely applies to you. All right, so just kind of to briefly orient you to what we'll be doing today, want to spend some time just kind of grounding ourselves in, the community action history and context. And then I want to spend a little bit of time going into some of the very commonly asked questions about CSBG and just kind of like lay the groundwork for what CSBG is. And then want to create some space for us to talk about some of the ways that CSBG is used and deployed in the Community Action Network, and specifically in public community action agencies or those within situated within units of local government. As we go, if you have any questions, go ahead, put them in the chat, raise your hand, come off mute. We'd love to chat further. But I'll go ahead and dive into a little bit of the content I have prepared for today. It's important to recognize that if you're here, you're part of the Community Action Network, and that network makes up an incredible set of over 1,000 community action agencies or other eligible entities who are all united in purpose to alleviate poverty, to revitalize communities, and to empower people. And so that's kind of the local level, but we also have an amazing state network as well, over 44 state associations who represent their state networks at, you guessed it, the state level. We have also CSBG state offices, which we're going to talk a little bit about today, national partners like NCAP, and we serve collectively over 15 million people at the national level are touched by the services of community action agencies. You've likely heard it by now, but in this year, we are celebrating or commemorating Community Action's 60th anniversary. And where we were founded was all the way back in 1964 with the signing of the Economic Opportunity Act. This act was a very important piece of legislation. There were a number of war on poverty strategies that were launched at this time. And essentially, when this act was first signed, when the Economic Opportunity Act was signed and community action was established, there was a recognition from the federal government that there were deep needs across the country as it related to poverty, and that every community was different, and that some of the communities who were most impacted by poverty had the least amount of resources to be able to address poverty. And so when the federal government started community action way back when, they had this vision that they would essentially take federal funding and grant it to the local level, to local people or local agencies to use that funding in the way that they saw best fit to address their local conditions, to leverage their opportunities at the local level, and to address those unique needs. And so this is a very unique approach at this time in particular. It's still a very unique approach in that it's not like, funding stream to do a very particular thing. What's really interesting is if you go back to the Economic Opportunity Act, our founding, the purpose of community action was to stimulate a better focusing of all available local, state, private, and federal resources upon the goal of enabling low-income families and low-income individuals of all ages in rural and urban areas to attain the skills, knowledge, and motivations and to secure opportunities needed for them to become self-sufficient. And so you can see here this idea that it's not just, here's funding to community action agencies to address employment or to, deal with health. Really, the funding was incredibly flexible, provided directly to local organizations to do what they saw best fit based on the needs of their local communities. And so in the early 60s, when we started, there was an incredible amount of innovation, tons of community action agencies all over the country, and a lot of really, there's a sense of urgency, a lot of activism going on with CSBG dollars, or I'm sorry, not CSBG, with Economic Opportunity Act dollars at the local level. And so, as you can imagine, when there are these funding streams that enable local power, that, whenever there's kind of a shift in power dynamics, that usually there's that rule that says, for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So obviously then there come about some attempts to kind of put some controls on some of the power that was being exerted by community action agencies. Because, by the way, with this funding that agencies were receiving, it was never just about, that one-on-one service, but also about creating new power structures, involving people with low incomes in the administration of not just the agency, not just in the anti-poverty strategies, but then also, in the broader kind of policy setting of local communities. And so, there was a lot of incredible work that happened very early in community action. And in 1967, there was kind of uh, this push to regulate community action as a result in some cases. So two very important amendments to the Economic Opportunity Act that are still relevant to where we are today. One was the Green Amendment, which said that the local elected officials would have the authority to designate who the community action agency was in their local area. And the reason that this was put into place was because there were, local officials who were feeling maybe a little unhappy with the idea that there were federal dollars coming directly to local organizations, and they did not have a say in who those organizations were or kind of what those organizations were doing. And in some cases, CAAs were doing things like challenging the power structures of local public officials and governments. And so in the Green Amendment, basically saying, okay, local officials will allow you to choose who the community action agency is. So public caps, something to be aware of is that the birth of a number of public caps actually comes from the Green Amendment to the Economic Opportunity Act, because particularly in big cities and in other places around the country, when local officials were given this authority, what they decided to do was to designate themselves as the community action agency who would receive that federal funding. And so Uh, uh, you know, private, some local governments still awarded funds or designated private community action agencies who have, a private board, but also then others designating themselves as the community action agency. Another just important amendment to the Economic Opportunity Act that's relevant today is the Quay Amendment. The Quay Amendment said that essentially this is the Quay rhymes with three. It's the rule of three, where we get our tripartite board structure, which says that that 1/3 of a community action board has to be public officials. At least 1/3 has to be people elected by people with low incomes, and 1/3, up to 1/3 can be the private sector. And this is really an attempt in some ways to limit maximum feasible participation of the people served, right? And people in poverty, and give more power to local and state officials. So two very big amendments that still resonate with the network today. So if you're here and you're going, wait a minute, am I a public cap? Am I a private cap? I'm not totally sure. Just to reiterate then that the difference between a public community action agency and a private community action agency, public caps are typically situated within a unit of local government. And so the government is the one who is deciding, what the agency does, deciding things like who, is hired to be the executive director, setting the budget, making HR policies, that kind of stuff. And then private caps, essentially the governing board is the responsible party for the community action agency. Board members have a personal responsibility for the well-being of the organization. And so that's the difference between a public and a private cap. And public caps, as I said, a lot of them kind of got their start back with the Green Amendment. So you guys are going like, that's a whole lot of history. And like, I thought we were under the CSBG funding, like where does that come in? And so the Community Services Block Grant, which is the primary funding source, or not the primary funding source, but the funding source that goes to community action agencies, was born in 1981. CSBG essentially replaced the funding that followed the Economic Opportunity Act. So the thing to be aware of is with the birth of the Community Services Block Grant, we now see a shift whereas before there's, federal to local funding, the feds are funding the locals to address those local needs. We now are seeing where the feds are going to fund the states, and then the states are going to be in charge of funding local community action agencies, setting state policy, and setting kind of oversight for community action. So up until this point, we have federal to local relationship. With 1981 Community Services Block Grant, that goes away. So one of the interesting things about the way that our block grant was approached too is that essentially 90% of the funds that go to states have to go to community action agencies or to eligible entities. So states cannot take the funds and just give all the funds to themselves. They have to pass through at least 90% of the funds that they receive. This rule, by the way, even though this slide says 1981, this rule is still in the current CSBG Act. Also then with the new block grant, in a lot of cases, the agencies who are eligible to receive these 90% funds were the same agencies who were eligible under, kind of the prior iterations of this funding. They were essentially grandfathered in. If you were a community action agency in 1980, you were an eligible community action agency in 1981 with the new funding stream. Also then states have now the responsibility to monitor and oversee compliance of local CAAs. And so states can receive up to 5% of the funds that are received for those administrative purposes. And then states are allowed to use up to 5% of the funds for purposes that are the same as the CSBG Act, essentially. So 90% has to go to locals, 5% for admin, 5% for state discretion. Not all states use discretionary funding, but some states do. Good thing to kind of get familiar with in your state, because what you're seeing here is the establishment of this idea that in every state, then how CSBG looks is a little bit different because CSBG is a block grant. And in a block grant, essentially what you have is limited federal oversight. And that federal oversight really just gives general high-level guidance to states. And then states are in charge of ensuring that the local network gets the guidance and oversight that they need with the funding. They're in charge of getting the funding to local agencies that they receive from the feds. So, with a block grant, there's just a little bit of a different approach. A lot of times we hear folks say, well, I want to go to the act and I want to see where it says, eligibility, or I want to see where it says, that I'm allowed to do this, that, or the other with this funding. And the truth of the matter is that in a federal block grant like this, a lot of that policy is actually set at the state level. The feds give guidance to the states to set the policy for their own for their own state. So I've just said this, that essentially states then are in charge of those state-specific policies. And states are in charge of making sure that all of you community action agencies receive the funding from the federal government, right? And so if you're asking, well, what makes me an eligible entity? Like what makes somebody eligible to receive this incredibly flexible CSBG dollar? Well, we just established that there's most agencies who were eligible entities in 1980 were essentially grandfathered in or legacied in 1981. And then, some of those agencies have, gone out of business, things have shifted. And so the state can designate community action agencies, but they can't just do that willy-nilly. There's a whole process if they're going to move funding or anything like that. We could go into that can of worms another day. But essentially, if you were an eligible entity, and you're designated by the state as an eligible entity, and then you have to have a tripartite board. So here we go right back to that Quee amendment of the Economic Opportunity Act. That tripartite board structure is required by the CSBG Act. Now, I do want to flag for you too that you might have additional board requirements that are set by your state because it's a block grant and the state has that authority to say, things like you have to have at least this number of board members and no more than this number of board members, or other kind of requirements might also be put in place by your board. But essentially, these are the things that make you an eligible entity. In a public community action agency, the tripartite board structure still applies to you. Even though they are not truly the governing body within your agency, they typically are called an advisory or an administering board. You are still required to run your CSBG funding through that board in order to be eligible to receive it. And so you do have to pay close attention to these requirements. I've heard public cap say, oh, well, that rule doesn't apply to us. And it absolutely, absolutely does. So just to take this a step further to talk about how the money and oversight works in this block grant environment, public cap or private cap, same approach. Essentially, at the highest level, you have Congress who allocates the federal dollars to CSBG. They set out the high-level CSBG Act itself, which is the high-level guidance for all of the funding, for community action agencies. The office who administers those funds then at the federal level is the Office of Community Services. You'll hear us say OCS. So OCS are essentially our federal office, and they receive that money from Congress. They receive the guidance from Congress, and then they take that guidance and interpret it and pass on that money and guidance to state CSBG offices. So OCS really works most intimately with state CSBG offices to ensure that they have what they need to be able to effectively administer CSBG at the local level. And then states receive that funding. They receive the guidance from OCS, and then they create their own kind of, state level guidance, additional state level guidance. And then they typically have a formula that they use to allocate money to the community action network more broadly. So, you're kind of coming down the pyramid here on the one side, and then, as from receiving that funding, there is also a requirement then that we report back up the chain, right? So we receive the money and then we have to be able to articulate, okay, so what did we do with that funding, right? And that you all likely know is that within the CSBG annual report that we report back up the chain to our state CSBG offices, to the Office of Community Services. The Office of Community Services then uses the CSBG annual report as the basis for an annual report to Congress, where they're detailing what difference the funding is making at the local level. So if you feel like your CSBG annual report goes into a black hole, I promise you it does not. It does influence ultimately what goes back up the chain to Congress. So I've been talking a lot about the act, but I haven't talked specifically about what's in there. And just want to demystify a few things about the CSBG Act. First, I want to say, if you've never read the Act, I recommend that you do look up the CSBG Act. It was last reauthorized in 1998. So if you're pulling up something that says 1998, that is the most current CSBG Act. There have been multiple attempts to reauthorize CSBG run by the National Community Action Foundation, or NCAF. And, efforts are ongoing all of the time to get CSBG reauthorized. So, if you're not tuned into NCAF, highly, highly recommend that you get tuned in there so you can stay abreast of changes and where you can help support this important initiative. But let's talk about what's actually in the Act itself. So when you read the CSBG Act, one of the first things you're going to see is that it defines the purpose of the funding. And any kind of funding, any kind of federal act will have a high-level purpose that defines what the funding is supposed to do. Also, then there's some requirements in there about, who are eligible entities, how, funds need to be allocated. That gets into that, the 90% of funds have to be passed through to CSBG eligible entities. There's also then requirements around the board, right? That tripartite board structure I just talked about is actually a requirement from our federal act, from the federal statute. There are also then requirements that detail that community action agencies need to basically address those local causes and conditions of poverty as found within their community assessments, which they are required to do to inform a community action plan, to inform a strategy that they're going to use to address those local needs. Also within the Act are requirements around ROMA, or performance management, requirements around reporting, and a little bit of guidance about unallowable costs. I'm going to say more about that in just a minute. So for any of my kind of policy wonks who are on the call today, one of the first things that you will notice about CSBG, the Community Services Block Grant Act, is when you go to the purpose, CSBG has an incredibly broad purpose. When I open up the Medicaid statute or SNAP statute, they have very specific purposes. You open up Medicaid, it's to provide medical assistance, right? If you open up SNAP, it's to provide food assistance. CSBG is unique because when you go back to our founding and our broader purpose, it was always about addressing those local causes and conditions of poverty. And so when you read our purpose, it says that, that the purpose of the funding is to reduce poverty, to revitalize low-income communities, and to empower low-income people to become fully self-sufficient. So here we have these very, very broad, a very, very broad purpose. And a very flexible purpose that is unusual, but also a hallmark of the community action approach, right? And then essentially within, when you go further, it says, for you to accomplish those purposes, that um, that essentially you can use the funding in a variety of ways to accomplish those purposes. So you might be trying to strengthen the community capabilities for planning and coordinating the use of a broad range of federal, state, local, and other assistance. So what does that mean? That means that you don't just have to take CSBG funding and provide direct, kind of assistance to people, but that you could be using your funding as a way to better coordinate and plan for other funding streams that are going to address poverty, so that we're sure that what's happening is addressing local needs and conditions. This is, again, a very unusual and unique aspect of CSBG. It's not just for, a specific purpose, but can also be used for kind of broader support of a variety of funding streams to better serve people. So then in B, you see that the organization of a range of services related to the needs of families and individuals, so that we can reduce poverty and help families achieve self-sufficiency. So this is much more in the vein of addressing or providing direct service to individuals and families with CSBG. Probably the most commonly understood way that you can use your CSBG dollars. But then you come down to C, and it's the greater use of innovative and effective community-based approaches to attacking the causes and effects of poverty and of community breakdown. C is about being an incubator and about trying things out and learning about approaches that may, significantly address poverty. This is your you can dream big and do some big things to move the needle on your organization's mission. Then in D, we get into this idea that not just that we're providing services, because we know that poverty isn't just a lack of income, right, or money. It's often also a lack of power, and that goes all the way back to the Economic Opportunity Act. But essentially within D here, we get into this idea that CSBG can be used to help create space for people who are experiencing poverty to be involved in their communities, to be involved in the power structures of their communities, and to essentially empower them to be able to respond to the local causes and conditions of poverty. When I see this, I also think about the promise of community action to help people help themselves and each other, right? This recognition that it's not just about being a recipient of services, but being the creator of outcomes, right? That the people that we serve can also be creators of outcomes. And then essentially within E, you see this idea that you can also use the funding to broaden the resource base to eliminate poverty. So gosh, guys, at its core, CSBG is meant to be a flexible funding stream. It's not an individual program. It's meant to be a flexible funding stream and a strategy that allows you at the local level to build strategies that address your local needs. Also, kind of a fun fact for you is that when states allocate that 90% of funding to local agencies, they are not allowed to direct how CAAs use their funds at the local level. CAAs are supposed to be addressing those local causes and conditions of poverty. That's ultimately what they have to be responsive to. Now, the state can tell you that something that might be unallowable, it might be an unallowable cost, but they can't say you have to put all of your money into employment or you have to put all of your money into education, because what's meant to be driving those decisions are your local communities. I've been rambling for a long time, and I just kind of want to check in. I don't see any questions in the chat. Are folks with me? Can you give me a thumbs up if you're with me? Do you have reactions? Okay, I see one thumbs up. That's good. Okay, 4 thumbs up. All right. Anything coming up for folks? Any questions? Ooh, okay. Then I'm going to move forward and just talk about a little bit about allowability within CSBG, because this is a very common question that comes up. is, show me in the CSBG Act where it says I'm allowed to use my funds in a particular way. And here's the thing, we just read those broad purposes of CSBG. Essentially, because it's a block grant, a lot of the decisions about allowability are made at the state level, and you're not going to like open the act and find a list of allowable activities with your CSBG dollars beyond those purposes. So if a cost that you're looking at, a program you're looking at, aligns to the purpose of CSBG, which we just went over, are very broad. If it's identified as a need or an opportunity in your community assessment, it has to, tie back to your community assessment. If it's not specifically prohibited, there are some prohibited costs, and it's allowable under OMB uniform guidance, and your state approves it, it can be allowable under CSBG. There are some prohibited costs, and I think I want to flag they are political activities, including voter registration, and then the purchase and improvement of land or property. Although that second thing doesn't mean all construction is unallowable. Cap law has some great resources if you're looking at, uh, uh, activities that might involve construction or maintenance of buildings. Cap law has great guidance about kind of what actually constitutes purchase and improvement of land or property. So this slide sometimes is very freeing to folks. And then sometimes it's also very frustrating to folks because they're like, I want to see where it says that I'm allowed to do this. And you're just not going to find that within the act itself. It just doesn't exist, right? So I want to give you a couple ideas of what's allowable, but this is in no way an exhaustive list because, to go back to it, if it fulfills purposes, your needs assessment says you should do it, your state says it's allowable, it's not one of these two things on this slide, you might be able to do it with your CSBG dollars. So some of the things that we see agencies do are things like, those individual level services, right? Maybe employment coaching, maybe job training, maybe education, right? Childcare assistance, bus passes, all of those things, you could be doing to help someone become quote unquote self-sufficient, which is probably not the term that we would use today, but is the term within the CSBG Act itself. And I do want to call out in that vein, Linda, I see your comment in the chat about rather than calling people our clients or customers, we say that we are working with our neighbors facing the hardships of poverty. I appreciate that a lot, Linda. Language is so critical, and we think it's important for every agency to kind of define the language that makes sense for their context. Have certainly heard a shift in that term of kind of neighbors, right? To remind folks that like the people that are assisted in community action agencies aren't like, it's not like people you don't know, right? They're your neighbors. They're the people who live in your community and rely on the community action agency. And the fact of the matter is a lot of us have periods of poverty in our lives. So also just I really appreciate that. Okay, so you could do it for services. You can do it to coordinate other funding streams, which is very unusual. So, you could be covering the costs of somebody to do maybe coordinated intake or eligibility for multiple programs to ensure that those services are really meeting the needs of people with low incomes. So very, very unique, flexible funding stream. Also, things like creating opportunities for people to engage in the community to build power. We see agencies who run leadership training courses, agencies who run kind of information about like how local government works, right? How to get involved in what's going on in local government. You can use your CSBG dollars in those ways. Also maybe supporting, community level revitalization, Also, organizational capacity building is allowable. Sometimes we see CAAs who take their CSBG dollars and use it to try to build the capacity of other nonprofit agencies in their communities. Also then too, some folks are using CSBG just to cover kind of administrative overhead, recognizing that a lot of agencies don't receive a ton of CSBG dollars. And for a lot of private caps, CSBG can be a very, very small portion of the actual, of their overall budget, but it's a critical one due to its flexibility. So just a couple other things that I want to flag for you before we maybe dive into some more conversation. A common question we get is like, well, where does it say how I have to determine eligibility within the CSBG Act? And actually within the act itself, eligibility criteria outside of, that somebody must be at a certain percentage of poverty, is not in the act because states are the ones who have to develop the eligibility criteria. So if you're talking to your friends across state lines and they're going, oh, I have to get, a month of pay stubs and this and that, how your state determines eligibility might be a little bit different. So you have to be sure that you are aware of your state rules for determining individual level service eligibility. The other thing that's not in the act, as I said, is you're not going to open it up and find like the list of allowable services. That just doesn't exist because a variety of services can be allowable so long as they tie back to those purposes and are not specifically disallowed. Um, Another question that comes up is folks want to know about the administrative cap, essentially how much money can you use for admin? And that is also set at the state level. There is no federal cap on admin dollars, but most states have admin caps and they tend to be somewhere between like 10 and 20%. Do want to flag for you, though, if you're unfamiliar, that how CSBG sees the idea of what are like administrative costs is a little bit different given our broad purposes, given that you're allowed to use the funding for the coordination of multiple services for organizational capacity building. In other grants, they might consider that admin. In CSBG, there's a good chance those things are not considered admin. So if you've never read CSBG Information Memorandum 37, again, I'll ask you to add it to your reading list right behind the CSBG Act. And if you're unfamiliar too, CSBG information memorandums are non-binding legal guidance from the Office of Community Services that give us an idea of how they are interpreting the federal act. So you can turn to these with some confidence, for kind of guidance from the federal level about how they see, different kind of questions that come up throughout, CSBG administration. So a little bit of information there about what's not in the act. Okay, so y'all want to know, want to flag, the different ways that community action agencies then use their dollars and some of the different models that we see. And I will invite folks on the call, to share how you're using CSBG at your local level. This is always a very fascinating and eye-opening conversation. Because we know that some CAAs use it for direct service provision, things like financial assistance, workforce services, coaching, case management, very common services. But also see agencies who use CSBG to create systems level change. They're doing things like advocacy work, broad community advocacy work. They're leading community coalitions. They're, you know, building leaders in their communities or empowering leaders. Also then, this idea of being community builders and organizers. So a lot of public caps actually subgrant their CSBG dollars. They might give those dollars to other nonprofit agencies to fulfill the purposes of the act. They might be doing community outreach and education. They might be doing civic engagement kind of work. So those are kind of high level examples, but would love to hear how folks are using their CSBG at the local level. So you could come off mute, you could put things in the chat about how you're using CSBG, or if you have questions about ways that you could be using your CSBG. So I'm going to scroll the chat. I see. Okay, so Linda, we've addressed your comment. Oh yes, Terry said we've heard some folks calling folks the people that they assist members. Love that. Um, oh, okay, and I see there's also a comment about the member language as well. Anyone on the call wanting to kind of share how they are using CSBG? An innovative way that you're using it, or a way that it's been used for multiple years in your community? Who's willing to share? Direct services, we have a walk-in site to serve community members, also have a VITA program to provide free tax help to eligible residents. Love that, Leah. Love to see that. Oh, and I think, Leah, you told us, Shanta, got it. Okay. Right, do I have that right? Yes. Um, and yeah, so VITA is another really common service that might be coordinated through your CSBG dollars. And a lot of federal sources would say you're not allowed to use our money to coordinate other services, but CSBG, that is absolutely something that you can do to try to bring services to people. Other folks, how are you using your CSBG dollars? What unique, exciting ways are you using your CSBG dollars? We do more than direct service to individuals and families, but interested in more innovative ways to tap into systems level change and community organizing. Anyone doing any kind of community level organizing that they'd be willing to share out about? Trelawney, while folks are thinking, I might throw out one kind of interesting example of an agency who as part of their community assessment, they are hiring kind of trusted messengers, people with low incomes um, from the community to assist in gathering community feedback to inform the agency's planning. So, like, part of what they're doing is they're giving folks work experience, they're paying them for that experience. Um, and then, like, as trusted messengers, they're able to get better information back to the agency that they can then use for planning. And a community assessment, by the way, can be a tremendous community resource. Like, if you pour a lot of your resources into doing a really comprehensive community assessment, that can also help other community organizations and other parts of the government in planning other programs. Pam, I see you said we work with subcontractors to maximize their effectiveness in the community, building upon their existing programs to provide additional services. Okay, so yeah, like, Pam, do you do like an RFP? Would you be willing to say anything else about that? Um, and maybe while Pam's putting that in the chat, we are working on creating a poverty-informed culture by providing training to staff, leadership, and communities. Linda, I was just talking to another public cap who said that they had hired, I believe it was an equity officer that they were essentially resourcing with CSBG, but was becoming a resource for other parts of the government too. Recognizing that deep tie between equity and poverty. So I thought that was a really innovative and interesting way to use the federal dollars. Um, CSBG funding also supports our board, which is engaged in a lot of advocacy work. Yeah, and oversees an advocacy training program. I'd love to see things like advocacy training programs. Love to see that. What else do folks want to lift up? What else are you doing that's exciting? When I worked at the local level, one of the things that we did, um, we had recognized that there was a community that had a lower kindergarten readiness rate than other communities, than other like zip codes. And so we started doing work that was not just about providing direct services to people, right, to kiddos to help them get ready for kindergarten, but we tried to focus more on like the infrastructure that was available in the community. So we resourced little libraries. We did a kit of take-home books for kids in a certain zip code, because we knew that if kids had books in their home, that correlated to improved kindergarten readiness. We also resourced the local, some of the childcare centers in the community with, kind of improved classroom resources, um, so that there was a good, high quality childcare facility within reach of people who could benefit from that service. Okay, Pam. So I see you saying, yes, exactly. As a public agency, we put out an RFP on our website and outreach to grants announcements list in the hope of working with new and innovative programs. Yeah, a little while ago, we did we did one of these kind of meetings about RFPs. I think that was a really fun meeting where we got to like look at each other's RFPs and talk about, how folks approach that. Would love to do that again. That would be kind of fun to see. I would love to learn more about how people approach systems level or community level change. Yeah, and actually, on the NCAP website, and Terry, since I might ask for your help here. We have a new systems level change toolkit that can kind of help you to think through some of the ways that you might think about some systems change work. Um, so we will see if we can dig that up while we're on the call. If not, we'll try to get that out to everybody. What else is coming up for folks? Always hearing of incredible local level work in the space of creating systems level change or community level change. And if you're doing some of that kind of work, we love to hear it, because we love to share out those examples with other entities. So not hearing anything at this moment, recognizing we're quickly approaching the top of the hour. Want to just share, oh, so we've done this part. How do you use your CSBG? There's the prompt. Um, you can keep them coming in the chat, but kind of as we're working towards winding up here, I do want to flag just a quick thing for everyone on the call. Um, Not related specifically to public caps, but something that will definitely impact you. We looked at kind of how funding comes down from Congress and then reporting goes back up to Congress, and the vehicle through which we report our impact. We report back to Congress on how we fulfilled our statutory purposes within the act is through the CSBG annual report. That annual report is required by by the act itself. And our CSBG annual report is unique in that it reports the activities of the entire community action agency, not just CSBG, because as we said, CSBG is used to leverage a variety of different funding streams, all with that core purpose of addressing poverty. And so you guys will get the slides. If you've ever wondered, like, this is kind of like how does a bill become a law? But this is really, how your annual report data becomes the report to Congress. So you can work through this fun flow chart. Happy to chat more about it. But the annual report has a lot of really key purposes at the national level to help us, one, fulfill that obligation to Congress, but also in helping us tell the national community action story. States use this data as well. I know there's a few state associations on the call, and they will tell you that this data gives them a lot of context about their statewide CSBG story, and it helps them to advocate for additional funding or advocate for policy change. State offices also use it for oversight and management, which they're required to do. And guys, at the local level, you use your annual report to help tell your story too, right? About the kind of impact you have. Use it for performance improvement, all that kind of good stuff. Want to share with everyone, in case you have not yet heard, that there are some proposed changes to the CSBG annual report. The Office of Community Services has to go through what's called OMB clearance, Office of Management and Budget clearance, every 3 years, where basically they have to get permission from the government to collect the information within the annual report from the network. That's a requirement for all kind of government offices who are collecting information from the public, that basically they have to ensure it's not too burdensome, right? That's really the purpose of this. And so OMB clearance is good for 3 years. Our current clearance of the national report, of the annual report, is actually about to expire. And so the Office of Community Services has posted in the Federal Register that they are they're seeking clearance again. But with this clearance, they are also proposing a number of very significant changes to the CSBG annual report. So this will absolutely impact your agency, how you collect data, and how you tell your story. And so within OMB clearance, essentially what happens is the changes are posted for comment, and then everyone in the public has an opportunity to submit what are called public comments and respond to the proposed changes and provide their feedback to the federal office about, how the changes are good, or places where the changes might create a problem, or suggestions that the network has. And so we are quickly coming up on the close of the first comment period. Comments are due to OCS by close of business on June 21st. That's this Friday. So if you have not yet checked out the changes in the CSBG annual report, please, please, please take a look at them. We have a whole page on our website that's talking about these proposed changes. OCS posted a very extensive document that talks about, different outcome indicators that are changing, different services that they propose changing. So recommend that you take a look at these changes, determine how they'll impact your agency, and submit comments to OCS about how those changes will impact you. OCS wants to hear from you. They want to know those impacts so they can ensure that the annual report reflects the needs of the Community Action Network, and does not create a burden for the Community Action Network. So based on the comments that OCS receives, they will make some revisions to the annual report, and then they'll post it again for further comment. The second comment period is only 30 days. And OCS has communicated that they intend to open it on June 28th, 2024. So do be paying attention to kind of that next comment period as well. Your comments are going to be needed then too. So I want to flag all of that for you. On the next slide, let's see. If you're wondering about how you can make comments, there's a email address that you can submit your comments to, and we'll post a link in the chat to our webpage, along with maybe if you get to our webpage, you can get to the OCS information collection. But you can submit your comments. Also, NCAP has a tool to help you think through some of these major changes. We have a comments framing tool if you want to check that out. This will help guide you through the major changes, some of the feedback we've already heard from the Community Action Network, and it'll help you just kind of get started on your comments. You don't have to write a 30-page letter to OCS about the changes. I've seen a number of folks who are just sending a very simple email to that provided email address to provide their feedback. That is totally okay too, all right? So check out our tool, check out our website, and if you have questions, you need help, NCAP is here to help you if you're planning to submit public comments. We do have some office hours this afternoon. So if you would like to join us and hear more about some of the proposed changes, and talk about how to approach feedback, you're welcome to join us then. If you just want to talk about the changes, you can also reach out to me. You can reach out to Terry. We also have a general email address, csbg@communityactionpartnership.com, that you can reach out to. We'd love to hear from you and talk about the proposed changes. Okay. I have not seen any other questions come in. Do folks have any questions, comments, feedback? Terry posted a link to an evaluation in the chat, so you can tell us how this was. So we do try to do these every quarter. We'll look to have another one of these likely in September. Um, and then again in November. So keep your eyes peeled for those dates and times. Not seeing anything coming in. I'll share that NCAP is currently enrolling for our Pathways to Excellence program. Pathways to Excellence um, supports your agency to assess yourself against best-in-class community action practices, and then based on that assessment, implement um, essentially go through continuous quality improvement efforts to improve your agency practices. We're currently enrolling for our silver and gold cohorts. That registration will close here in July. July 19th is the last day to enroll in silver and gold. We take bronze tier enrollments throughout the year. We have a goal of engaging 60 agencies in excellence to commemorate our 60th anniversary. So if you're on the fence, want to encourage you that now's a great time to jump into Pathways to Excellence. Also, if like you heard a whole bunch on CSBG and you're like, that was a lot of information. CAPLA has a fantastic series on mastering the AB CSBGs on their website that you can learn more about some of these CSBG specifics and requirements and just really dive in there. So check out that resource. NCAP, we have lots of ways to stay connected. Would love for you all to sign up for our newsletters. We have a regular kind of weekly newsletter. We have racial equity updates. We have some great weatherization content. Also, our public policy updates that come out monthly. So subscribe, stay connected. We also have a convention coming up at the end of August. We will be in Seattle, Washington. We hope to see you there. Registration is still open. Again, it's going to be a big celebration commemorating our 60th anniversary. So hope to see you there. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. Reach out. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to connect with you. Contact any one of us. Let us know if you have any questions, need anything. We're here. We're in your corner. Okay, with that, I think we're going to end here. Thanks everyone for your time, your attention. I hope this was helpful, and see you soon.